Hello. I'm an old man, 94 years old, and as I look back over my life, I can see that the changes that happened from the time of my birth until now are beyond comprehension for most people. I've been able to see both the residue from the old immigration type mindset, the old wagon wheel era, I'll call it that, I'll call the pre-war era the wagon wheel era, because it was still hanging on in the mindset and the engineering minds of our world, essentially. There were large cracks in that front, but still, the attitude of the people, the customs, the mores, the morals, the values, the general belief in God, which was relatively universal. The few people that didn't believe were well known, and the effects of World War II. And I'm hoping that I can communicate some of the massive changes to our lives, the way we live today as compared to the way we lived before the war and during the Depression and the times that I remember before the war. And I want to start, you got to start somewhere. I'm going to describe as best I can the background of the relatives that immigrated from France and the background that they lived in, which I can't imagine how they even survived, let alone immigrate to the United States and specifically to Frenchville, Pennsylvania. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this and the subsequent videos that I've spent the last 3 years trying to make. And I know that they're crude and there are a lot of unsmoothness involved. You're going to have to excuse the amateur composition of this stuff, but it's the best I can do, and it's not been easy, but it's been great fun. So here we go. My name is Don Rougeux, spelled Rougeux. I'm making these videos to record some of the events and social situations that have affected my life during the past 94 years that I've been here, and why I'm sitting here in Louisville, Kentucky on this day, and how my ancestors provided that fortunate event. I was born in a deeply wooded area of central Pennsylvania in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and I'm the fourth generation of the immigrants that came from northeastern France in the Champagne region, from a village by the name of Rougeux in 1835. But in any case, I want to start with their eventual departure from rural France. I've been fortunate and able to find so much information that's been buried for centuries, and the job that provided me the capability of going to France and doing hands-on research and finding people there who were willing to help me with local information and invaluable hard data dating back to 1625, and with other less specific but some written data dating back to about 800, and then some intimations of information dating back before the time of Christ. So I've been given a broad insight into the long history of the people who lived in the northeastern part of France for a long time, and the vicissitudes and difficulty they had in surviving all those centuries, and the reasons that they came to the United States in the first place. After I've concluded giving you the information that I have for that early time, I want to pick up the times of my life from April 1929 until reasonably current. And what I want to do, though, before I start philosophizing and talking about my own personal experiences and events, I'd like to lay a background of a glimpse, actually, of what happened to my and yours ancestors in Europe and so forth during the many, many centuries that they lived there. I've been very fortunate in being able to get ancient documents that were contemporary to a large degree and written by competent people of lifestyle in the 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. that were experienced by people who documented the events. So I'm going to start this story in 1945. It's really a little astonishing to me, really, how just a few words can have such an enormous effect on everything. Words are very powerful, and this will prove. But anyway, in 1945, my cousin Francis was one of the first ones to be discharged from the service at the end of the war. He had been one of the early inductees, and he had served in Africa and all through Italy and up through France to the end of the war. And he had 5 battle stars, and he had won the Bronze Star for heroism under fire for saving wounded soldiers. He was a medic during all this period of time. I never heard him talk about the experiences he had, but it's not hard to imagine the horrible sights that he must have seen continuously during those long war years. He was very happy to be home, obviously, and we had interesting conversations, and one of the things that he casually dropped was the fact that one night when they were advancing through northeastern France, I later determined that this was either in August or September of 1944. But anyway, it was at night, and they were driving the Germans back, and he said that he saw road signs with our name on it. And over there, every village has road signs on every road within a mile or half a mile of each other. Villages are closely clustered together over there, and there are hundreds and hundreds of little villages with their own names and road signs leading to them. And so this is what he had seen. But since he wasn't there as a carefree tourist, he had no time to do any investigating. After he was discharged, he was immediately shipped home, so he never saw anything more than that road sign pertaining to us. In 1977, I was in London on business, and I was there during their Thanksgiving holiday period. So everything was stopped for that celebration, and I had nothing to do. And the thought came to my mind, or the memory came to my mind, that of this event, of these words that he had said about the roadside. So I decided to go to the French embassy and validate, or whatever, this bit of information that I had remembered. So the man at the French embassy soon pulled out a book when he heard my story, about 8 or 10 inches thick, and laid it on the table. And we soon found the village name, Rougeux, and told how many telephones it had, which wasn't very many, and the number of houses and so forth, and of course the location. He wrote down a few words on the route that I should take to get there. And so the next morning I went down to Victoria Station, caught the ferry across the English Channel, and then a train to Paris, where I had to change from the West Gare to the East Gare across town. These are railroad stations. And there I caught a train to Dijon, about 300 more miles. During this period, my stomach had been upset for some reason, and the train ride to Dijon was really a difficult one for me because I was nauseated and I couldn't get over it. It didn't seem to want to leave me. So I arrived in Dijon around midnight, and I stepped off the train. I entered into a foggy, rainy, and reasonably warm atmosphere. And I had no place to go, but I looked down through the mist down one of the streets, and I saw a little sign that said hotel. So I immediately hiked my can down to that place, and when the clerk told me that they had a room, I was really relieved, to say the least. So I went to bed, and the next morning I got up and I caught a train to Chameau, which was according to the instructions that the embassy had written. So I got off the train at Chameau, which is about 60 miles or so north of Dijon, and I went into the train station to inquire about a cab, how I could get one, because that place was ostensibly only 5 miles from Rougeux. But when I got in there, I told the clerk what I was doing and everything, and he said, "Oh, you make big mistake. Rougeux, 25 miles from here. You should have gotten off at Chandelry." And I'd passed through Chandelry, and the train stopped there, but I didn't get off because that's not what the little note was telling me. He said, it's very, very expensive to go to Rougeux by cab from here. And I appreciated that bit of advice, and I really didn't want to take a cab that far and hold the cab there, and while I did something. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, but I didn't want to be pressured to immediately get in the cab and return. So that wasn't an option for me. And about that time, I hear a voice behind me, and it said, "Do you want to go to Chandelry?" And I turned around, and there was a man there, a middle-aged man, and I told him, of course, yes. And he said, "Well, I'm taking my bus back down to Chandelry, and I don't have any passengers." And he said, "I'd be glad to have you ride with me." He said, "I won't charge you anything." So, talk about manna from heaven. So, in maybe 40 minutes or so, we were at Chandelry, and it wasn't any time before I was arriving in Rougeux in the cab. And so as we pulled in to Rougeux, I noticed a sign, hotel. So I dismissed the cab there and climbed the 2 stairs up to the long porch that fronted the building. It was a 2-story building. And I knocked on the door, and there was no answer. It was closed. And I quickly turned to see if I could catch the cab. But I saw him disappear around the curve in the mist, and I knew that was not going to happen. So I stood there a little perplexed. I couldn't see any outside payphones. There weren't any at that time, although later on they did install one nearby. But in any case, I was stranded there in the middle of nowhere, basically, because this is a little village out in the country, out in the farming country. And so I didn't stand there a minute till I heard a voice saying, "Qu'est-ce que tu veux?" Really in a nasty or a loud, aggressive voice, which meant, "What do you want?" And I looked across the street, and this middle-aged woman was standing there looking at me, and so I picked up my grip that I had with me, and I walked over to her, and I told her who I was and where I was from and everything. And I did this in French because she didn't speak any English. But fortunately, I could still speak passable French. As an aside, my dad and I always spoke French from the time I was an infant until he died, unless we were in company where it wasn't appropriate to do that. But we always spoke French together. So I still was semi-fluent anyway. But anyway, there was a transformation there. It was unbelievable. Her demeanor and just the excitement that someone from the United States had come back to Rougeux. And apparently I was the only one that ever came back there from the time he left in 1835. So I was really a King Tut there for a while. She invited me in for lunch, but I just didn't feel up to eating at that point. And so, but anyway, she called the mayor, who worked in a bank in a nearby village called Rougeux, a much larger, small town, about 2 miles away. It wasn't long before he came around up the street in his Renault, and of course he was all excited to see me too, and he invited me over to his house and introduced me to his wife and 2 little kids. And the day wore on, and they had supper, and they invited me for supper, so I did stay and eat. And so it was a really interesting, animated afternoon or day. So he took me over to Fayetteville, where he worked. There were 2 hotels over there in that village, that small town. And so I got a room there, and that's where I slept that night. It was kind of rustic there. I had to go downstairs and ask him for a piece of soap so I could take a shower. But anyway, the next morning I came downstairs and the owner, well, I guess uh, the man and wife owned the place, but the man was there at the counter, and we had a animated conversation. He was really, I hadn't seen him the night before, but he knew my story, and so he offered to take me to the countryside, drive around the countryside and show me the sights. So I was really pleased and happy with that. So we went out to his car. He had a little Renault, and he was a huge man. His shoulders were as broad as any. I've never seen a man with broader shoulders, and he wasn't quite as tall as I am, but he was a big man, and he had a time squeezing in behind the steering wheel of that little car. But we drove around, and he was pointing out the various sights. Really wasn't all that much to see in terms of sights, but it's beautiful countryside, rolling and farming, fertile ground there. It was obvious it was really prime farming country. We drove around to several villages, and I was really tickled to be able to have that service without even thinking about having it. As we drove along, all of a sudden he pointed sideways. He says, "Protestant, Protestant." Of course, I knew what he was saying. It was Protestant. People lived there in that house. We got to talking about religion and stuff, and I asked him how often he went to church, and he says, "Oh, tous les Pâques." It meant, what he was saying was that every Easter, he wanted to be sure that he implanted that his faithfulness and holy attitude on my mind by emphasizing that he went every Easter without fail. I thought it was pretty funny. In any case, he took me back to Chandlery to the train, and I came home. A couple of years later, Shirley and I went to France and Rougeux, and we met Mrs. Marchand, and she told me that her husband had died in the interim period. And also the big guy from the hotel in Fairbelotte, the one who took me around, had also died shortly after I left there the first time. So I never got a chance to speak to either one of those again. But anyways, Mrs. Marchand was great. And I asked her about my relatives, whether there were any relatives living around there. And she told me that there was one, that all the other Rouges had moved away. Opportunities for employment in that area were really slim other than farming, and if you didn't want to be a farmer, the only choice you had was to go to the cities. And she said there was one family there, and he lived over in Pierrefitte, which is about 3 miles away, but she said that his nickname was Dr. Syrup. And I asked her, why was he called that? And she said, well, he really drinks a lot of wine, and he claims that it's good for his health, so he got the nickname Dr. Syrup. But I never did meet him. He wasn't there at the time, and he died too later, and before our next visit, after that one. So I never did meet him. But nevertheless, she did give me a good lead. She told me that there was a man in Pierrefitte by the name of Francois Joffrin, who was a retired college professor, and he liked genealogy, and he was an interesting guy. But he wasn't there at the time I was there, and I never have met him. But we have had numerous contacts over the period of time that, well, maybe a decade. It's been a little while since I've heard from him, but nevertheless, I wrote to him and told him what I was looking for and if he could help me or not. He wrote me back and told me that he would see what he could do. But while we were there at Rougeux, Mrs. Marchand told me that the archives for the region were located in Chaumont, and maybe I could find something there. So Shirley and I drove up to Chaumont, and we went to the archives, and I went to the young woman there who was the clerk. She couldn't speak any English at all. And I asked her for the files for the passport applications for the years 1830 to 1840, because I wasn't confident at all that I had any firm data about when they had left France. So she went and got a book. We can call it a book. It was a bundle of paper in a bookish form, I guess you could call it. It was the thing that was about 2 feet long and 12 inches wide, and bound with a string, and really old. So I took it over to the table and opened it up, and Shirley and I began to look through it, and we found, well, there were a lot of pages. It was about 2 inches thick, and the entries were all in handwritten ink and cursive writing, and difficult to read. The writing was fine. It wasn't crude or anything. It was well done, but it was fine. It was either slanting letters or sometimes with flourishes that made it really difficult. Of course, it was all in French too, which didn't help the situation at all. But we looked for 3 hours or so trying to find just one word, the name Rougeux, or any other name that I knew lived in the Frenchville area that had come from France, which was the whole population at that time. But we couldn't find one name that was recognizable, let alone a name like Rougeux. So I told Shirley, let's give it up. It's too difficult. We were both getting headaches and getting on our nerves. So I took the book back to the clerk, and on a whim, I just asked her if there were any other documents pertaining to that period. And she said, "Oh yes, les indigents." The indigent file she had there, and so she went and got it, and it was a similar book, about the same thickness too, and we opened it up and immediately found exactly what we were looking for, and including names, many names of local residents of Frenchville that had come from the same area. So it was really a welcome change to be able to find something that made sense and was valuable to me. But anyway, I made a copy of it, but the passport application included, of course, John Baptiste Rougeux, my great-grandfather, and his wife, and 2 infant girls, and his aunt and his grandmother, who were both in their 60s. There were 6 people that were included in the application. The indigent file was for those who could not afford to pay the application fee. And the reason they were allowed to apply was that the king had decreed that anybody that wanted to leave France could leave freely, because the unemployment and the terrible economic situation that was still lingering from the revolution that had begun in 1792. While it had ended in around 1814 with the imprisonment of Napoleon, the after effects and the smaller uprisings and just terrible economic difficulties and lingered well past 1840 here. So, in any case, the king, as I said, had issued this edict in order to relieve the population of. So that was a very major step in the resurrection of, well, the genealogy and the opening up of the mysteries that I don't think anybody else had ever really done any work like this on our family that I'm certainly aware of. But finding Francois and those archives were the crowning jewels in the beginning of a lot of years of effort and work to determine the contents of the books that I was subsequently able to write about our family. While we were there, and I don't know if it was this time or the third time that we were there, but Shirley and I walked through the village, and I encountered this old guy working in his garden on one of the afternoons that we were there, and so I walked over to him and I talked to him a little bit, and he was a very pleasant guy. He was older and stooped over, and I asked him what happened to him during World War II. He said he was 14 and he was working in the garden this early June day that Rougeux was engulfed by the German armies. And the Germans captured him and took him to a work camp and he was forced to work in a factory during the war. He was starved severely. I forget how much he told me he weighed when he came home, but it was substantially less than when he left. Knowing the endless numbers of times the Germans had invaded France, in that area especially, I asked him what kind of neighbors the Germans really were. And he paused and pondered a bit and thought about it, and he said, well, he said, they're not very good neighbors. I thought that was a pretty Christian way of responding to that question. We also had a little experience. This was definitely the last time we were through in Rougeux. We had stayed at a hotel a few miles from Rougeux, and we made a quick driving tour. By this time, Mrs. Marchand had also died, so I didn't know anybody there, and Francois was also missing too at that time, and so we stayed at a hotel along the main highway leading into Rougeux. And as typical, these hotels are owned by a married couple who run it mutually, and are always interesting to talk to. They're always garrulous or open to conversation. Anyway, the owner, the man there, I asked him the same question, what happened to him during World War II? And he was a partisan. This is what he told me. He didn't join the French army. He was a partisan working against the Germans. And they did a lot of damage. They blow up railroad lines and so forth. But he said he was wounded 3 times. First time was through his upper arm, and he showed me the wound. It had a deep depression where the bullet had gone through, but it didn't hit any bones or anything. And he recovered from that. And then the second wound, not long after that, was in his left hand, in the lower part of his arm. So he had some damage there that he hadn't recovered. He could use his hand, but it was semi-crippled. But the third one put him out of business. He quit all activities after that one. And the bullet went in behind his left ear and went through his head and came out the tip of his nose. And on closer scrutiny, you could see the little groove there in his nose. It's a wonder it didn't blow it off, but nevertheless, it came out there, but it ruined his ear. He couldn't hear a thing out of his ear. But he said that one was scary. He decided he'd better quit, or he's going to get, the next one won't be so kind to him. But and then also at that last visit, I decided to do some investigating about my grandmother. My grandmother was a French woman who came from that same region, a little village about 5 or 6 miles from where my great-grandfather came from. They came over in the 1840s, about 15 years or so after my great-grandfather. So they didn't know each other over there at all. But anyway, I discovered where some people by the same name lived, Mignot, M-I-G-N-O-T. So Sharon and I drove over there, and we found this family, and it was amazing that the wife was the one that did all the talking. She could speak English. But she said that she knew of the Mignots that went to the United States, and she knew that one had come back about 10 years after they left there. And she couldn't remember the name, though. And we had an interesting conversation. She said her husband was a young man during World War II. He was about 17 or 18. And he didn't want to go into the German army, and he didn't want to be captured. So he lived in the woods for about 3 years, surreptitiously hiding from the Germans. Every opportunity, he would sneak home and get some food, and that's how he survived during the war. But the Germans were brutal. They murdered at the whim, at their pleasure. They had no motives to do it, but they slaughtered many people, and they enjoyed slaughtering the cows and animals that were grazing in the fields, which was a real serious loss to the farmers. So they made life absolutely terrible and terrifying for the population. I think that's enough time spent on the introduction to this whole project, and I think we'll call it a stop here now so that the video isn't too long and too boring. So see you in the next one.